Hi everyone and welcome to Riskologists. This podcast is brought to you by Optimise and hosted by me, Pat Bradshaw.
And me, Nicola Boyle. Optimise are thrilled to host this podcast series where we'll be speaking with some of risk management's most respected and esteemed thought leaders from across the UK and beyond.
Throughout Season 3, we'll be exploring our guest journey within risk management, as well as exploring key conversations and topics around the overarching theme of the season being the future of risk management.
Our goal is to create a platform in which ideas and thoughts can be shared in order to inspire and educate our audience, and to ultimately give back to the risk management community across the world.
So without further ado, let's get into it. Hi everyone and welcome to this episode of Riskologist. As always, I'm your host, Pat Bradshaw.
And I'm your co-host, Nicola Boyle, and today we're joined by Paul Miller. How are you doing, Paul? Thanks for coming along.
Hello, nice to meet you, Nicola and Pat. Glad to be invited today, my first time to do a podcast.
No, it's all good, all good. To be honest with you, I feel like that's the same with most people we get on. Podcast game is well, we're sort of the first podcast experience that a lot of people have, but yeah, we'll be gentle on you, don't worry.
It's my first rodeo as well, so we're getting there though.
Yeah.
So we'd just like to start off every episode the same, just with a bit of a journey to date. Your background, your career, you can be as detailed or vague as you like.
Okay, yeah, I mean, when I was asked to participate in this, the topic was future of risk management, but I thought before talking about the future, I would, as inspiration, I'd look back at my career a little bit to give some of that inspiration. And when I look back, I recognised how much change there's been, not just in the industry, but in the whole way things have been happening in the market, particularly in our sector and also in our industry, in the profession that we work in. So there's a number of key factors, and I think we'll be touching on those later. But my background really, I was quite academic, strong at maths and sciences, managed to get to Cambridge.
Wow, can't relate.
Broad degree in engineering, but really I didn't know what I wanted to do, so I tried to keep all my options open, and that's why I did a broad engineering course until at some point I needed to make a decision. And I was at a presentation, there was talking about engineering and particularly civil engineering, and that really started to inspire me. So I put all my efforts into becoming a civil engineer. It's just unfortunate that when I graduated in early 90s, we were hitting one of the biggest recessions that we'd had in a lifetime, and very few companies were taking anybody on. And it took me quite a long time to actually get a proper job. I was very determined to get a job in engineering, and I was lucky enough to get taken on by Sir Robert McAlpine. And
wow.
Although I actually spent most of my first 3 years was looking for wind farm sites for their subsidiary in renewable energy systems. So it was a great opportunity, and I really enjoyed my time. I was there nearly 10 years. Through that period I got chartered. But when I came to the end of that process, I realised now I've achieved my objective of becoming a chartered civil engineer. I didn't really know if that's what I wanted to do for the rest of my life. And I realised later that maybe some of my skills and that were not necessarily best suited to working in a contracting organisation. So I took a year off to go and do an MBA at Cranfield. And that for me was a real opportunity of personal discovery. And I fundamentally got a much better understanding of who I was as a person, what my strengths were, what my weaknesses were. And it was here that I got this insight into getting into risk management. And I'd never even heard of project risk management. I'd used health and safety risk and all those good things, but we'd not done risk management as a formal process. And when I started actively looking around for opportunities, it was very apparent that a lot of the quantity surveying organisations had diversified significantly. They were no longer being quantity surveyors, they were moving into project management and other sort of consulting type activities. And so nearly all of the major quantity surveying companies were taking on people in risk, and it was all quite new and novel, and I thought I can do this, and I joined a company called Cyril Sweet, who don't exist anymore, but they took me on, and they were in a fabulous company to work for. I think both McAlpine and Sweets both had a very collaborative culture, and I think that's what attracted me to them. And I think that's been a constant throughout my career. And risk for me is about collaborating with companies, with people and others. So cut a long story short, I rose through the ranks and ultimately became a director at Sweets. But I felt I needed a new challenge. And I then transferred across to Faithful and Gould whilst also working on Hinkley Point C, which was quite a major project going on at the time. And since then, Faithful and Gould have become a new company called Atkins Realis, and we've been through a massive transformational journey in the last few years, which has been an exciting journey for myself, but it's allowed me to experience some really amazing opportunities on some major projects. And I think risk as a profession, when I look back over the last 20, 30 years, it has changed a lot over those years, and that's really what I wanted to sort of talk a bit more about.
Love that.
Nice.
Love that. Thanks, Paul. Yeah, I think it's quite refreshing actually to reflect a little bit, because as you mentioned earlier, the theme of this season is, in inverted commas, the future of risk management. And I think we've had some really good conversations, understanding where the profession's going, but we've not really spent a huge amount of time reflecting on where we've come from. Obviously, Nicola and Lucas and I have sort of relatively still a bit wet behind the ears in terms of how long we've been in the game. So, and I can already see how much things have changed in the short time that I've been in the industry. So no, really looking forward to the conversation, Paul. I was going to ask actually, just one of the things I thought when you were discussing your journey today is you mentioned that you had a little bit of turbulence. Well, there was a turbulent sort of economic time when you first came out of uni looking for a job. Obviously, I wasn't alive at the time, so I don't know exactly if it's how similar it is. But for anybody who's listening at the moment who might be going through similar struggles, have you got any sort of words of wisdom in terms of persistence and not throwing the towel in? And
my general advice would be take every opportunity you possibly can to learn. When you're early in your career, there are so many opportunities, and you probably can't know what the benefit of those are going to be straight away, and it will possibly later when you start to really appreciate the value that they provide. But when one of the benefits I had in my career was I just used it to insert as an engineer just to get as much experience as I possibly could. That helped when things then got tougher, because you had so many different skills under your belt that you could apply yourself in different ways.
Yeah.
And that versatility and adaptability to be able to change to do something else, I think is extremely important. So even though risk might morph into a different way of working, the skills that we get from risk management are aligned to so many other disciplines that you could easily transfer into a different discipline, or equally transfer that discipline into risk. So I think keep an open mind, take every opportunity that you can, and make the best of it, because there are always things to learn. And that's what I love about projects and construction. I'm always learning.
Love that.
Yeah. I was just going to ask, was there quite a lot of transferable skills then you felt that with being a chartered engineer that you could relate to risk when you then moved into that role? Yeah,
I mean, for me, I didn't think it was an option until suddenly I saw somebody who actually was a chartered civil engineer. He actually worked for a boutique risk consultancy, and he presented at Cranfield.
Okay,
and he ran what I now know as PRA, a risk analysis, running a model. And I thought, wow, that just I'd not seen anything like that before. And once I'd seen that, and I'd seen someone like me doing it, I thought I could do that.
Definitely.
And you just need that conviction to think, I can do that, and you will get there if you put your mind to it. Look at what needs to be done. There's training you need to do. There's skills you need to learn. I think the advantage I would say of having been a civil engineer is that I feel confident enough to ask and challenge project teams, on a technical basis.
Yeah,
of course.
I don't necessarily know the detail, but I feel confident enough to challenge them to and extract more information and maybe offer some alternative ideas that maybe they hadn't thought about. And I feel that gives me that confidence to be able to have those conversations.
Yeah. No, it's really interesting. I think just on transferable skills, I touched on it in season 1, I think, when I was mentioning that I think a lot of transferable skills aren't immediately obvious. Like before I got into risk management 4 years ago, I was in a career in sales and marketing, and when I first got into risk, I sort of found myself reflecting a little bit, thinking, God's sake, I wish I'd just done risk at uni and I would have been so much further along. But there was so many transferable skills from my previous career. Obviously, as you know, people is 90% of the work when it comes to risk, human and cultural factors. So being able to hold the conversation, being able to facilitate, being able to do all that good stuff, you sort of think, actually, I'm sort of glad that I did that. And likewise with the engineering stuff, like you say, you can have more intimate conversations on like a technical level, and that's certainly something that I wouldn't be able to do, and probably many people in the industry wouldn't be able to do as well.
Yeah, I think that'd be a huge advantage.
But equally, you need to make sure you don't get caught going down a rabbit hole. So sometimes you have to bring people back and keep it at a higher level. So I think some of the skills, particularly I learned on the MBA, were some of those other softer skills that maybe I didn't have in at the time, but they're things that I use a lot now. And I think one of the things that we did recently with my team was to look at the different skill sets that you use in risk. And I think what came out of that is that through the process, we use all those different skills. We're using, our people skills in terms of collaborating. We're using our technical skills in terms of organising and making sure that we understand the technical side of it and the numeracy side of it.
Yeah.
We're also trying to make sure that everyone is engaged and bringing that team spirit, as well as at times having to be forceful and directive and telling people what to do. And I think that is both a challenge but for me it's that variety. So you're always having to step into different roles at different times, and I think that's, for me, what makes risk management so exciting. Completely
agree. Let's get stuck in then. So, as everybody will probably have noticed from the title of the episode, the future of risk in an ever-changing world. That's what we're going to be discussing today, reflecting a little bit on how the discipline and how the industries and what have you have evolved over the last few decades, and I guess where we see that moving towards in the future. Out of interest, Paul, obviously when we discussed prior to setting up the recording and stuff, we teed up that it's the future of risk management is the theme of the season. How come you landed on this out of interest? Have you been reflecting quite a lot, given the sort of steep upward trend of a lot of things changing in the discipline over recent years, or was it a bit of a light bulb moment when we asked you to thought, actually, thinking about it, that would be good, because I've never really sat and thought how much it has changed?
Yeah, I think when I look back, when I started my career as a risk consultant, it was a very new and novel idea for many project teams.
Yeah.
And when we would do a risk review, we would spend quite a lot of time explaining what risk management was, explaining what the process was, and it was all quite, new and novel. Very quickly, project teams grabbed hold of it and took it themselves, and as a part of the process, needed to own the process of risk management. And you start to see it far more embedded within the project teams, to the extent that our role changed. We would often be doing full-day risk workshops, and it would start to become more catch-up sections with other project managers or members of the project team. So the way in which we operated within the projects changed. And again, I think it's just recognising that the maturity of risk has increased massively over the last few years. I think when we hit the recession in the sort of late 2008, 2009, at that time I was thinking that could be the end of risk management as we know it, as a separate discipline. But bizarrely enough, I think soon after that we started to see the onset of some really major projects coming online, and that has helped, I think, give a rebirth to risk management. On these big, major, complex projects, you cannot possibly have one person looking after risk, and you need a more specialist approach. And it's these major projects which I think have allowed us to continue to grow and develop that as a discipline. And I think there've always been major projects, but I think the use of risk management in the way we now use it is far more sophisticated, and that's been helped by advances in technology and the way that we integrate ourselves with other disciplines.
Yeah. Do you feel like the level of maturity. So I guess what I'm trying to ask is, obviously now when we talk about it being embedded in the organisations and it's part of the culture, that for me is probably when risk management is done very well. And obviously when it's done badly, as everyone listening to this will know, it can be a complete waste of time. In terms of that sort of maturity journey of risk management over the years, moving from being sort of new and novel to being embedded, how quickly did you see the maturity of organisations over the course of your career reaching that? Sorry, I'm repeating myself. That level of maturity. Did you feel it was quite that new and novel thing wore off quite quickly and it got embedded, or it was a little bit slower?
I think it probably varied in different sectors. So certain sectors were I suppose had largely because they had more projects and invested in risk management as a discipline themselves, and made sure that it was properly applied on their projects.
Yeah.
I think prior to that, I don't think the value of risk was properly understood or seen. But I think, it would have been around early 2000 through to about 2005, 2006. I saw a massive improvement in the way projects were starting to do risk on a lot more consistent basis.
Yeah. What do you think the reason for that was?
Well, because I think it was no longer novel. Once you've explained the process to people get hold of it quickly, and it becomes embedded quite quickly once people are familiar with it. Mm-hmm. And you can only, once you've explained it a few times, people naturally pick it up and then start using it. I think that what differentiates certain sectors is the maturity around the time and effort required to make it work. Yeah. And the benefits arising from it. And part of that is to do with the consequences of things going wrong. So if you're working on a major complex project where the implications of being late or over budget are very significant, it is definitely worth investing time and effort in making sure that you get your risks properly managed, and on time and on budget. So it's partly to do with the outcome of failure.
How hurt people have been with it. So just sort of moving on then. So how has the consolidation of markets and industries over the past 3 decades, I should say, changed the nature of risk management organisations? Do you find that the collaboration has improved with the development of the NEC suite?
So I think for that, that has been a massive change culturally within the organisation. So when I started my career, the construction industry was extremely adversarial. And by that I mean that the old way of doing things, of procuring projects, was you define a scope, give it to the contractor who prices it, and then they deliver what they think is right, and then they spend a lot of time giving claims for why the design wasn't perfectly accurate, and what they found when they went on to build the project wasn't aligned to the design, and that they needed to put those change control in. I think with Latham and Egan, who delivered some major reports on rethinking construction in the sort of mid-90s, it was very much towards trying to address those fundamental problems and get a far greater collaboration. And that's where we saw the new engineering contract being launched, alliancing partnerships. And they do make a fundamental difference, because you are involving the contractor as early as possible in the process. You're involving the designer and the client. And as I say, I've worked on some alliance programs, and I've seen firsthand how they can allow everyone to make the right decisions very early in the project and fundamentally de-risk the project right from the outset. So everybody understands the risks that they are taking on, and it's properly managed and properly allocated to the right parties to manage them. Doesn't always work, but it's certainly an aspiration which I think I've seen work in practice.
Yeah. It's great. It's crazy to think. Like, obviously, we were introduced to the NEC suite of contracts relatively early in our careers, and trying to imagine a time where something along that of that nature wasn't there or didn't exist, it's hard to imagine how things ever got done, or agreed, or anything actually happened.
Well, I think so. The company I first worked for were seen as gentleman builders, and the way it used to be done was a conversation probably with the client later, to sort out the costs at the end of the day, and it was probably done over a pint in a pub, which would not be conceivable these days, because there was this sort of gentleman's agreement that they'd get the job done on time and then we'll sort the money out later, and that was how business was often done, and it was that almost a trust between people and organisations. I think now with projects having got so big, it's gone beyond the ability to just trust two individuals. You've got to go further than that, and unfortunately, when if there's an opportunity perhaps to play the contract in a certain way, naturally people are orientated to do that and incentivised to do that. So unfortunately, it can lead to the wrong behaviours, which isn't helpful to the overall objectives of the project.
I was going to say, it could, you're in a spot of either when people start pointing to individual clauses in a contract and saying, oh, but as per X, Y, Z, then X, Y, Z, and that's sort of bordering on the adversarial, really, isn't it, as well?
Yeah, and unfortunately, contracts only go so far. I mean, I remember you used to say that, the contract is only there for when things go wrong, and for most of the time, you should almost be trying to avoid to have to go back to the contract. You're just getting the job done, but unfortunately, it's when things go wrong and when things don't go to plan and people are losing out. That's when the contract is there, and it is there to help protect both parties. Yeah. But it needs to be done in a balanced way so that both parties are, are protected and incentivised in appropriate amounts.
Yeah. No, of course. Okay, moving on then. So one of the other themes that we touched on in sort of the pre-work for the episode was around globalisation. So I guess reflecting back over your career to where we are now, and I guess where you think it might be moving in the future, how do you feel the level of globalisation over your career has influenced how risk management is undertaken?
Yeah, I think this it sort of feeds into what I was saying about how the market has changed over the last few years, and I think when I was looking at careers then, there were hundreds of different small companies to go to potentially get a job with. Lots of small engineering companies, lots of QS and project management companies. So many of those have been consolidated in the marketplace, and a lot of well-known names are no longer heard about anymore, that were there 30 years ago. And increasingly you're seeing these global players coming into place, which ultimately it's almost about having a fully integrated supply chain that can operate on a global basis. You need to operate on some of these big major projects and programs. They need to be able to attract resources from all places to deliver them, and increasingly we're needing to use all of the skills that are available across the globe, and larger companies are offshoring some of those resources to use cheaper resources that sit elsewhere in the world. And it also, because of technology, we're able to employ those people 24 hours around the clock, so we have a longer working day, and that can only work with some of the more modern advances in technology and the way that the consolidation of the market has occurred over the last number of years. And obviously there can only be so much consolidation, because I think you've seen a lot of the larger companies form themselves. But I think what we're seeing now also is a recognition that there's also space for the smaller, more niche consultancies that can fill certain gaps and certain things that the larger companies can't. And so often it's about having good partnerships with the supply chain, so that you can provide everything that's required at the price point that the clients want.
Yeah, that you've sort of preempted what I was going to ask. Actually, I was going to say, do you think that sort of all these smaller niche organisations no longer existing, with sort of natural selection taking its course and they are obsolete, or if there's a place for them even in this sort of more what's the word I'm looking for, as the industry sort of developed over the years. But to be fair, Nicola, Lucas and I are sort of living, breathing proof of that. We come from a very small niche risk management practice. It's just whether I think some of the examples you gave, like engineering and stuff, and I've seen a lot of sort of the well, not a lot, but there's a handful of risk management consultancies sort of popping up here and there. But whether or not you think any other parts of the project control sort of enterprise, that's still the same as well, or if it's just risk related.
No, I think it's not. I don't think it's just specific to risk. I think it's a measure of the fact that there are advantages of being big and there are advantages of being small.
Yeah.
But there's not. If you're caught in the middle, you're neither one or the other. So I think what you're seeing is there's an increasing number of larger, bigger enterprises, and there's probably an increasing number of smaller niche companies that can offer probably lower overheads, greater adaptability, and specialist skills in certain areas.
Yeah.
So I think it's the two extremes. But if you what both types of organisation need to recognise is that, particularly with the changes in technology, things are changing very quickly. So a lot of this is about agility and being able to adapt to the market that we operate in. And companies that can't adapt or can't change to that changing marketplace are probably the ones that aren't going to be surviving. And that's what we've seen over the last few years. And you're starting to see which of the companies that have been able to adapt and can deal with the changing demands of clients and what the world needs, which is driving ultimately what the purpose why we are here.
No, I completely agree. And in terms of that driving that change and adaptability and resilience, I think some of the things that we've discussed on previous episodes have been very much, even in inverted commas, breaking the iron triangle, where the KPIs, if you like, or the value of the project, some elements of quality or time or even cost might be shifted in place of things like how sustainable the project, how responsible they're acting. And like you say, it's those organisations that are actually demonstrating that they're doing that are the ones that are going on and being resilient.
Yes. And ultimately, I see the profession of risk is to provide better informed decision making. That's the primary function of our existence. And what I think the skills that we have are bringing together all of those bits of information. It's all about cost, it's about time. Increasingly, as you say, it's about carbon and our carbon footprint and how and our ability to deliver the scope that is required, particularly if we're being asking ourselves to do things that are more technologically advanced. You know, energy is a key factor now, and we've got to be able to find new ways to access new resources. So there's new engineering that's required to do this. And again, that's what's so exciting about our industry and our profession, that we are able to adapt and change, and it just keeps on adapting and changing.
Completely agree.
And then just touching on, you just mentioned technology there. Obviously, that's probably an entire topic on its own, but this is probably the steepest curve in change in the past few decades. Firstly, are you surprised by this, and what's the speed that things have changed, or as someone that's been in the game as long as you have, is it something that you embrace?
I think it's interesting to say that, and on one hand, I do wonder whether it's accelerating. In some ways, it is, but equally, it's all relative. And you know, if you were to look back at the Victorian age and how they dealt with things, it's completely different. And there's been a lot of change since then. I mean, I was just reflecting about when I started as an engineer. Most drawings were done by hand on a drawing board, and they were just introducing CAD. We didn't have mobile phones. We didn't have laptops. We had computers, but they were very bulky and very slow. All of those things have disappeared, and we've adapted to use tools in a different way. And now that particularly IT has moved on very fast. I think IT is obviously one of the areas that we're seeing a lot of change, and it's enabled things that would not have been dreamt of. And like with COVID, it put a lot of companies under a lot of pressure, but it's forced us to work in a different way, and we can now do things virtually via Teams that we would not have dreamt of being able to do 10 years ago. So we're always changing, and I think it's just recognising that is going to happen. It will not stop. Now there's a move towards more AI-driven technology, and I think we just need to recognise that and think, how are we going to use that tool in the best way we can? And I would like to think that there's a new way of operating that will use AI. It will not displace the risk management function, but the way in which we use data to inform decision making will change, and it will just be a different way of doing things. But we've all been through that change, and it will carry on.
Yeah. How have you found I guess obviously from when you started your career in the early 90s, like you say, thinking back to doing everything by hand, and you've got the computers, but they're all big and clunky and what have you. With the way that automation works now, you could probably automate maybe 95% of that role. How do you find people similar to yourself, yourself specifically, have sort of adapted to think how you can justify your role from something where you've come from 95% of that, what I used to do is now longer done for me by technology. Obviously, it frees your time up to do much more value-added stuff. But yeah, I guess I'd be interested to hear how you've sort of reflected on that.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that the role of what we do will change, but I think a lot of the skills that we have will be used in a different way. Mm-hmm. So it may be moved towards around interpreting the data that is collected and compiled with new AI-driven tools. But understanding what that means and the implications of that can only really be done by humans. And I think the unique role that we have in risk is that we've probably seen and been involved and witnessed that on other projects, and we can bring that knowledge and human dimension that you cannot replace with technology.
Of course.
Yeah. Nice. So just moving on then. As projects become larger, more complex, how has the complexity introduced new factors, and sort of what are the challenges in managing them? Are they different from they were 30 years ago to now, or are they relatively the same?
Yeah, I mean, for me, I think the growth of larger, more complex projects has by nature changed the way in which we look at risk. Originally, when I started risk, it would be on a single project, and I'll be focused on the risks around that project. And then increasingly, I got involved on larger programs where we had multiple projects, and you started to consider how risks might roll up. It's a program level.
Not just siloed.
And it's not quite so siloed, and there's overlaps between what's held at a program level versus what you might hold at a project level. And then, if you go further, you can then start thinking about it being a portfolio and an even more complex interrelationship between the different programs. That requires a lot of data, and that can only be done with some of the advances in technology that we've seen. You would not have dreamt of trying to do some of the things that we can now do in a matter of minutes or hours. And collect that data and examine it and understand it. Yeah. So I think it's using all of those skills, using all of that technology, but in a far more advanced way. And as we get more global, we're going to have also, I think, different, diverse approaches to things, linked to how we are set up culturally in different countries, different ways of doing things, and not every country has the same way of doing things. And again, you need to understand how that local country does things, but that diversity itself can bring new ideas and new ways of doing things. So you might reject because they're doing it differently to you does not necessarily mean they're doing it wrong.
Yeah.
And there are opportunities to learn from how others might do it differently.
Yeah.
Love that.
Makes sense.
Love that. So again, just reflecting back on something you mentioned earlier, Paul, in terms of when you were sort of fresh out of uni, there was a pretty heavy financial crisis or recession, if you like. Obviously, in recent years, there's definitely been political upheavals, pandemics. We're in a pretty turbulent time at the moment. How do you feel, or what do you think that organisations and projects have learned over the last few decades in terms of resilience, in terms of preparing themselves for things like pandemics, financial crisis, things like that? Do you think they're a little bit more resilient now due to the scars, or again, do you feel like lessons learned might not be implemented as well as they could have been?
I think definitely, yes. I do remember the recession we had in the early 90s. There were many, many companies who did not recruit anybody in that year or even for 2 years. And it was marked that for a period there was probably a generation of people missing from the industry.
That's crazy.
It's obviously long enough ago that's been passed.
Yeah.
But there was definitely a realisation that when the market did come back online, and construction does tend to be quite cyclical, it can have boom and bust cycles, bigger than perhaps other industries, but equally it will come back online. And when we're building bigger projects and programs over longer time spans, you can start procurement of a major program in the depth of a recession when you're delivering it at the peak of demand and you cannot find resources. So I think companies have learned that you cannot sacrifice recruiting talent at every age group, but particularly our future career, early careers. You need to keep on bringing that lifeblood through, but recognising that the marketplace they're going to operate is going to change, and it will change. We will have peaks and we'll have troughs. But I think companies have learnt that, and that's part of the reason for the move towards globalisation, is that it offsets the fact that you've got a recession in one part of the world by not having recessions in the other part of the world. So you can offset some of that effect of localised recessions.
Yeah, sort of a double-edged sword, isn't it? Because, like you say, organisations just get hyper risk-averse and think, right, recruitment freeze, we're not hiring anyone whilst we're going through this turbulence, and then in the year's time, it's like, oh, the consequences of my own actions. We're being hit again.
Yeah,
getting hurt by it.
Yeah, and everyone suffers because then everybody wants the same resources. Yeah. I mean, the individual who's in high demand doesn't suffer, I suppose.
Yeah,
but
of course.
There's only so many people like that, and after a while it becomes, if you can't fill the role, you end up having to almost change the role or adapt how you do things. So somebody somewhere is losing out.
Yeah. Yeah. No, of course.
So just sort of looking at the other topics that we've sort of spoken about in other episodes, that'd be climate change, global warming, ESG. These are sort of overarching themes that we've had in other seasons as well. Given that the focus of future risk management, we've discussed net zero pledges, breaking the iron triangle, we've mentioned before. I'd like to name just a few topics. Could you reflect back on early attitudes to these sort of themes and like where we are now and where you feel that we're going?
Yeah, I think there's been a big change of attitude towards global warming. Even fairly recently, there's been a sort of naivety perhaps in terms of whether we really is global warming due to man-made influence, and I think it clearly has. Yeah. And we clearly need to do something about it. I have a lot of hope that as the human race we can do something about it. And I think we're now starting to see a real concerted effort. You can see that in the industry. You can see that with the move towards away from using carbon in all aspects of what we do. Carbon is becoming a key determinant now on decision making on projects, and it will continue to be so, more so, I would say, going forward than at any time that we have had in the past. Yeah. So I think global warming is driving a change away with trying to deliver projects and the sort of projects that we want to need to be delivered. And it's about having sustainable energy, and it's about having, but it's more than that. It's about how we operate as well as how we travel to work and how we reduce our carbon footprint on the planet. So I think it will change, and I think technology has enabled a lot of that, and there will be new advances in technology that allow us to hopefully extend energy sources. And if we can tackle nuclear fusion, then we've got a major chance of avoiding having to use future oil and gas reserves. But I'm not going to start commenting on that.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. We had I'm not sure if it'll be out yet or what order of precedent it's going to be, but we had a conversation with Dr. Alex Budzier recently about net zero and the pledge to go net zero, and he was discussing similar points, and we sort of touched on the technology side of things, but then he also mentioned how there's very forward-thinking engineering companies who are sort of using optimizing adjacency, where they're actually being incentivized not to build new assets, but to use assets that already exist.
Yes.
And build with them, build on them, build where things have already existed. So the reason I'm raising that is because, like I say, I lean immediately to what sort of technology like carbon-free concrete and steel and that sort of stuff. But there's also really cool incentives like that, which, coming from an engineering background, I'm sure you're aware as well, but I just think are fascinating. Yeah,
I think... and that is what is fascinating, and what drives me is that curiosity on all things. I say the engineering itself is interesting, but I think just seeing new solutions come into play, and that those provide massive opportunity, and that's part of our role is looking at opportunity as much as it is as a threat. We do need to look at the upside and look at where can you invest to maximise that opportunity.
No, of course.
Yeah, definitely.
Of course. And just touching on, like I say, we've touched on climate action and things like that. In terms of the role of collaboration between private and public sectors, how has that sort of relationship been in your career, and how do you see that sort of shaping the future of risk management, like I say, from a climate perspective, from an infrastructure resilience perspective? Do you feel like that's a relationship that's improved and will continue to improve, or vice versa?
Yeah, I think particularly in the realm of risk, where projects have become so big and complex, I don't think it's easy or simple for one organisation to hold the risk.
Yeah.
And so what we see on some of these very large programmes, ultimately, the UK government PLC have to ultimately take the burden of some of these major programmes, and we could not possibly go forward on some of these projects without that public backing and funding to make them happen. Obviously, that feeds into the whole private sector because it keeps industry alive and it keeps jobs and all the rest of it. So the two start to become quite political, and I don't want to comment on anything political here, but I think the move to larger, more complex projects will inevitably require public levels of funding, and for that, therefore, you need that visibility of what costs are going to be, timescales. So it actually requires a lot of the skills from risk management to help as part of answering that question about how long projects will take, how much will they cost, and maybe answering the question around what will be the carbon footprint that they impose on the earth.
Yeah. And
I think we've got an opportunity to continue to help answer those questions, which will inevitably get asked.
Love that. Thanks, Paul. So I guess just rounding off then, when I was sort of reviewing some of the themes and stuff that we've discussed in this episode, I was trying really racking my brains trying to think what would be a lovely little concluding point. I think I found one. So obviously we've spent loads of time focusing on the past and the future and apparent risks, changes, in attitudes and behaviours and cultures and stuff. What are certain principles or practices that you would consider timeless, in inverted commas, and how should current and future leaders balance these with the adapt to change moving forward?
So, sorry, because just answer. You're talking about behaviours or
No. So just in terms of attitudes, in terms of behaviours, in terms of practices, in terms of fundamentals, what do you think are particularly elements of it? Obviously, you've got the risk management process, which has been here since time immemorial and is very unlikely to change. But are there any other areas that you think are, given the pace and speed in which things are changing and continue to change, are there any areas, practices, fundamentals, attitudes, whatever you might say, that you think are timeless and they will continue to stay like that regardless of how quickly the world moves?
Yeah, I think the key word for me is collaboration. I've been very lucky in my career that I've been able to work with very collaborative people, very collaborative organisations, very collaborative clients, and I've seen when you don't get collaboration, what that can do. Mm-hmm. I can see where you do get strong collaboration, how that can really help. And it's clearly, that what we talked about, that change in the industry towards more collaborative ways of working, I think that trend will continue. And I would say that the companies and people that can remain collaborative and inclusive in terms of the people that they work with will be the ones that will prove more successful, because they're the ones that are going to get the best out of the team, get the best out of the resources that they work with, and ultimately solve the solutions for our clients and the society that we work within.
Yeah,
makes
Love
sense.
That. Cool.
So just rounding off, last final point from us, then we sort of always end the episodes the same, so it's a bit of a tradition, as we say. What piece of advice would you give your younger self at the start of your career? If you were to go back, what would you give your younger self with all the knowledge that you know now?
I think with hindsight, I've been extremely lucky, and some of those things have happened by luck, some of those things have happened by accident. But all throughout, I've kept faith that by continuing to focus on what I'm good at, what I enjoy, and what is right for the project and programs that I've worked on, generally leads to the right outcome. And I think I would not lose any opportunity to learn and grow. And if that means doing a role that may not be purely in risk management, but it gives you insight into other things, then I would still take it, because you never know how that might help your career in the future if it gives you insights into new ways of doing things. So I would say always maintain your curiosity. The world is going to change, your career will change. You need to be prepared for change and be adaptable to that change and seek out opportunities to learn.
Yeah, amazing.
Great advice. Finally, from me, Paul, if anybody wants to get in touch with you today, following on from this episode, to talk about some of the really pertinent things you've mentioned, what would be the best POC?
Yes, you can always get hold of me on LinkedIn. I do try and respond to people as and when, but obviously I'm always busy. But no, I do regularly post on LinkedIn, so that's probably the best route.
Love that. Okay. Paul, amazing. Been an absolute pleasure. Thanks so much for having us. We forgot to mention at the start, we're in sunny Manchester city centre today in Paul's lovely office, and very grateful for having us. So Paul, thanks so much again. It's been a pleasure.
Yeah,
thank you very much. I've really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Yeah.
Cheers, dude.
Cheers. And that's it for this week. If you enjoyed this episode of Riskologists, be sure to follow, Optimise and Riskologists on all of our social media channels, where you can subscribe to the podcast and be notified of every episode so you don't miss a thing.
Please like, share and leave reviews to help support us and increase our reach within the wider risk community.
And join us next time, where we'll be chatting with another leading figure in the world of risk.
Until then, thanks for listening and take it easy.